Welcome to the Market Decoder, your go-to podcast for digestible market insights. Join us as we deep dive into the latest trends, uncover valuable insights, and share expert perspectives you won't find anywhere else.
Welcome back to the Market Decoder. You know why you're here, to get smart fast, to cut through all the noise, and to get to what matters. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. Nuclear energy is a hot topic, and we've got a ton of analysis to dig into. But we're not going to bury you in information overload. We're going to break it down, see where nuclear power stands today, and where it might be headed.
It seems like everyone's talking about nuclear, and it's not hard to see why. I mean, climate change is a big deal. Energy security is always on everyone's mind, and the world just keeps demanding more and more power.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Those are the big forces driving this renewed interest in nuclear. And what's interesting is that the need for clean and reliable energy isn't just some future problem anymore, it's a major issue we're facing right now.
Absolutely.
So let's get down to the basics. For someone who wants to understand nuclear power, where do we even begin? What's actually going on inside a nuclear reactor?
Okay, so at its heart, nuclear power relies on the process of nuclear fission. Basically, you're splitting the nucleus, the center part of an atom. Usually, we're talking about uranium that we're working with. And when you split that atom, it releases a huge amount of energy as heat. It's kind of like harnessing this natural atomic instability to control or to create a control and very powerful release of energy.
Okay, uranium. I've heard of that a lot, but it's not just raw uranium in a reactor. It's not as simple, right?
Right, you got it. So the uranium is processed and made into these incredibly tough little pellets, ceramic pellets. They load these pellets into sealed metal tubes called fuel rods. A bunch of fuel rods are then grouped to form a fuel assembly, and finally, the reactor core is made of many of these fuel assemblies.
Okay, fuel pellets, fuel rods, and then you have the fuel assembly. So it's like the kind of the building blocks of atomic power. Is this where the famous chain reaction happens?
You got it, yeah. So the chain reaction starts when a neutron, a tiny particle, hits the nucleus of a uranium atom. This causes the uranium atom to split into smaller atoms, releasing energy and even more neutrons. These new neutrons can then hit other uranium atoms, causing them to split and release even more neutrons. So that's how you get this self sustaining chain reaction going.
Wow, so it's like a nuclear domino effect. Okay, I'm getting a visual here, but how do you keep it under control? How do you prevent it from going haywire?
So that's where control rods come in. Control rods are made of special materials that are very good at absorbing neutrons. They act like sponges, soaking up all these extra neutrons. By putting these control rods into the reactor core, we could absorb some of these neutrons, slowing down the fission rate. And if we want to increase the power, we can just pull these control rods out, letting more neutrons cause fission.
So the control rods, I could think of it like a brakes in the gas pedal of this whole process, right? Now, how does all this turn into electricity?
So, nuclear fission generates a tremendous amount of heat. This heat is used to boil water, turning it into high pressure steam. And then we use this steam to turn and spin turbines, and those turbines are connected to generators. Hence, we finally get electricity.
Ah, got it. And we also talked about uranium enrichment earlier. What is that and why is that necessary?
Okay, so natural uranium is made out of mostly something called uranium 238 and a smaller amount of uranium 235. It's the uranium 235 that splits easily and can sustain a chain reaction. So enrichment basically increases the concentration of uranium 235 in the fuel, making it more likely to sustain that chain reaction we're looking for.
Okay, it's like boosting the reactive part of the uranium. Makes sense. We're concentrating the good stuff. Just to remind us, how much energy can we actually get from uranium?
It's pretty mind blowing. So, one tiny pellet of enriched uranium can generate the same amount of energy as about 150 gallons of oil or think of it another way, 800 kilograms of coal.
Wow, this is a lot of coal for one tiny pellet.
Yeah, so this has huge implications of how we handle nuclear fuel, how we transport it, and how we store it.
It really shows you the power of the atom.
Okay, we've got a basic understanding of the science behind nuclear energy. Now let's zoom out and take a big picture. How important is nuclear energy in meeting the world's energy needs?
Yeah, the global energy consumption is definitely on the rise. A lot of things are driving this. Record breaking heat waves, as example, more industrial activities worldwide, and also the shift to electric vehicles. Of course, all those data centers and AI systems that need a ton of power. It's estimated by the International Energy Agency, the IEA, that data center related consumption could double the 2022 level by next year.
So the demand for electricity is definitely there. So how much of the demand is nuclear power meeting right now?
Well, in 2023, nuclear power plants generated about 2,600 terawatt hours of electricity worldwide. So that's about 9% of the global total. It's a slight increase from the year before. But here's the thing, nuclear's overall share of the global electricity mix has actually been shrinking over the last few decades. Back in 2000, for example, it was about 16%.
Interesting. So nuclear is producing more electricity overall, but its piece of the pie is getting smaller. What's the reason for that?
Well, first, the biggest reason is that the overall electricity demand is growing even faster. And we've seen this incredible boom in renewable energy, especially solar and wind. In 2024 alone, we added a record 700 gigawatts of new renewable energy capacity. So that's massive growth and is happening much faster than any growth in nuclear power.
Yeah, so the energy world is changing quickly. Now, I'm guessing that different countries rely on nuclear power in different extents.
Yeah, definitely. In 2023, there were 14 countries getting at least a quarter of their electricity from nuclear power. France is the champion. About 70% of their electricity are coming from nuclear plants. Then you also have Ukraine, Slovakia, and Hungary also rely heavily on nuclear, getting about half their electricity from it.
Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit and talk about geopolitics. How does nuclear energy factor into international relations and a country's energy independence?
Ooh, this is where things get really interesting. You see, nuclear power gives countries a way to become more energy independent. It's a reliable source of electricity that doesn't depend on fossil fuels, which often have to be imported. So, by shifting to nuclear, countries can strengthen their energy security and reduce their reliance on things like oil and gas from other countries. And here's another big advantage, nuclear plants can store enough fuel on site to last for 2 years. So, that gives them enough buffer against any disruptions or global fuel supplies.
That on site fuel storage is a huge plus in a world that can be unpredictable, to say the least.
Yeah.
But what about the technology itself? Who controls that and how does it impact things?
Yeah, controlling the technology and especially the design, the construction, and the uranium enrichment process, that's a big source of power and influence on the world state. You've got major players like Russia, China, the US, France, and South Korea. They're all competing to provide the nuclear technology to countries that want to develop or expand their nuclear programs. It's a high stakes game with big geopolitical implications.
Speaking of Russia, our research highlighted that they use their nuclear technology as a tool for leverage. What's the story there?
Right. So Russia has been strategically pushing it into nuclear technology as a major export for years. They built close ties with countries that become dependent on them for reactors, fuel, and expertise. And this is a trend we're seeing right now. A lot of the nuclear reactors being built around the world are actually using Russian and Chinese designs.
That shows you the influence that they currently have in the nuclear energy sector.
And this has prompted the US and its allies to offer alternatives to countries that are heavily relying on Russia for their nuclear needs.
Sounds like energy and foreign policy are closely linked, and uranium enrichment seems to be a particularly sensitive issue.
You've hit the nail on the head. So, the uranium enrichment is a highly sensitive process, and this is both politically and technologically speaking. For example, the US has relied heavily on Russia for enriched uranium in the past. But given Russia's willingness to use energy as a political weapon, this dependence is a bit of a risk. So there's this push in the US to boost domestic uranium enrichment. They want more secure supply chains, maybe through partnerships with other countries.
It's not just about who builds the reactors, but also about who controls the fuel. It's a two pronged approach: reactors and fuel. What about developing countries? How are they approaching nuclear power?
Yeah, that's a good question. Many developing countries, and particularly in places like Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Africa, and Eastern Europe, they see nuclear energy as a way to become more energy secure and to meet their climate goals at the same time. They often team up with the more established nuclear powers to build and run their nuclear plants. But these partnerships can also risk concerns about potential debt traps and political influence. It's almost like just the conventional source of energy, right? There's a delicate balance between getting the energy they need and protecting their own sovereignty.
Yeah, it sounds like a high stakes game of balancing act on the global stage.
Okay, we've talked about the science, the geopolitics, the players. Now let's get into the heart of the debate. What are the pros and cons of nuclear energy? Let's start with the arguments in favor. Why is nuclear power a good option?
The most compelling argument for nuclear power is its incredibly low carbon footprint. I'm talking about virtually zero carbon dioxide emissions during operation. This makes it a very important tool in the fight against climate change. When you analyze the entire life cycle of nuclear power from mining to waste disposal, its greenhouse gas emissions are actually quite low, comparable to wind power and even lower than solar. That's a huge point in its favor in a world that's trying to decarbonize.
Absolutely, a low carbon footprint is a big deal. And what else makes nuclear power attractive?
Well, we have to talk about the incredible energy density again. A tiny amount of uranium can produce a lot of power, which makes transportation and storage much easier. And then there's reliability. Nuclear plants provide base load power, meaning they run continuously. This is different from some renewables like solar and wind, which depend on the weather. That consistent power supply is super important for keeping the electricity grid stable and meeting demand around the clock. And we already touched on energy security by reducing reliance on imported fossil fuels and having fuel stored on site. Nuclear power boosts a country's energy security. It also has a relatively small land footprint compared to some other clean energy sources, especially if you want to generate the same amount of power. And another plus, of course, is modern nuclear plants are designed to run for a really, really long time, some for up to 80 years.
And let's not forget the economic benefits as well. The nuclear industry creates a lot of jobs in a bunch of different sectors, from construction to engineering to manufacturing. So, to sum up the pros, there's low emissions, high energy density, reliable baseload power, energy security, minimal land use, long operation life, and job creation.
That's a pretty impressive list, but we can't ignore the downsides. What are the big concerns about nuclear power?
Okay, the biggest concern, and is a legitimate one, is the issue of radioactive waste, especially the spent fuel from reactors. This stuff stays dangerous for a very long time, and I'm talking about thousands of years. And right now, there's no internationally agreed upon solution for permanent disposal. And then there's also the risk of accidents. While the odds of a major accident in a modern nuclear power plant are statistically low because safety standards are so high, the potential consequences once they happen are still huge.
We saw that with Chernobyl and Fukushima. Those events really shook people's confidence in nuclear power.
Yeah, those accidents are hard to forget.
So, what about other drawbacks?
While building new nuclear power plants is super expensive, the upfront costs are high and it takes a long time to build them as well, often more than a decade. This makes it harder for nuclear to compete with things like natural gas plants and renewables, which are becoming cheaper and cheaper. Public perception is another major hurdle. People are afraid of accidents, worried about the waste, and they associate nuclear power with nuclear weapons. All of this makes it tough to get new nuclear projects approved.
It sounds like winning over public opinion is a huge challenge for nuclear industry. Are there other environmental concerns besides the waste disposal?
There are, unfortunately. For one, nuclear plants need a lot of water for cooling, and this can lead to thermal pollution for rivers and lakes, which ultimately can harm the aquatic life. And while uranium is a relatively abundant resource, it's still finite, meaning we will eventually run out. And finally, decommissioning old nuclear plants, taking them apart safely, is a very complex and expensive process.
So, to summarize the cons, radioactive waste, the risk of catastrophic accidents, high costs, and long construction times, and a generally negative public image. It seems like the classic dilemma of weighing the potential benefits against the very real risks. Okay, but we're hearing a lot about a nuclear renaissance these days. What's fueling this renewed interest in nuclear power?
It's true, there's signs that nuclear power might be making a comeback. The International Energy Agency, the IEA, predicts that 2025 will be a record year for nuclear electricity generation. Public support for nuclear is also increasing in many countries, including the US, where a majority of people now support expanding nuclear power. And globally, more people now support nuclear energy than oppose it, according to recent surveys.
That's a big shift in public opinion. What else is contributing to this potential resurgence?
While we're seeing more and more countries announcing plans to build new nuclear plants or expand their existing ones. Over 70 gigawatts of new capacity are under construction worldwide right now, and about 30 countries that don't currently have nuclear power are seriously considering adding it into their energy mix. Two main things that are driving this trend.
And what are those?
First is the urgency of climate change, with nuclear being seen as a reliable, low carbon source of energy, and concerns about energy security pushing countries to look for stable domestic sources of power. And secondly, new reactor technologies, especially small modular reactors, the SMRs, are playing a role in this shift because they are potentially cheaper, faster to build, and more flexible in terms of where you can put them. They also have enhanced safety features compared to older designs.
So there are concrete signs that things are changing. The narrative around nuclear power seems to be shifting. Now let's address a tricky but important issue: the connection between nuclear power and nuclear weapons. How closely linked are these two sides of the nuclear coin?
It's a complex and controversial issue for sure. There's no denying that nuclear power technology and nuclear weapons technology share some common ground. One key area of overlap is the uranium enrichment that we talk about. So, the same technology used to make fuel for power plants can be used to make highly enriched uranium, which is needed for nuclear weapons. Another link is plutonium, which is a byproduct of nuclear reactors. Plutonium can be extracted and used in weapons as well.
Those are some pretty direct and concerning connections. So, how do we make sure that civilian nuclear programs don't end up as weapons?
Well, we have a pretty robust international system of safeguards in place, mainly managed by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. So, the IAEA carries out inspections and checks to make sure that nuclear materials and activities are being used for peaceful purposes, are not for developing weapons. And the cornerstone of this whole non proliferation effort is the Treaty on the Non Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT. Basically, it's an international agreement to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons, promote peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and work towards disarmament.
So, even though the technologies are related, there is a global effort to prevent nuclear weapons from spreading. But does having a nuclear power program automatically increase the risk of a country building nuclear weapons?
That's a good question. While the concerns are understandable, there's no clear evidence that a commercial nuclear program inevitably leads to weapon development. So lots of countries have been using nuclear power peacefully for decades without even trying to make weapons.
But the bottom line is that we need a strong international system to prevent the misuse of nuclear technology. It's reassuring to know that those safeguards are in place.
Okay, last but not least, let's talk money. What should potential investors know about nuclear power?
Investing in nuclear is interesting. There are opportunities, but there are also some unique challenges. On one hand, there's definitely potential for growth. We need to decarbonize, electricity demand is increasing, and governments might provide more support. The big hurdle is that building traditional, large nuclear plants is incredibly expensive and it takes a really long time, which makes investors nervous.
But we just talked about the SMRs being a more attractive investment. Why is that?
SMRs are seen potentially more appealing because they're supposed to be cheaper to build and they could be built much faster. They're also more scalable, so you can build them in phases, which spreads out the investment. Also, government support is going to be key here. Financial incentives and faster licensing could make investing in nuclear less risky.
So government policies can really make or break the nuclear industry.
Yeah, those are important to consider. And finally, investors have to think about the potential of accidents, the long term cost of dealing with nuclear waste, and the fact that public opinion can really affect a nuclear project's success. But once a nuclear plant is up and running, it provides a pretty stable return on investments. It runs for a long term, and fuel costs are relatively stable compared to fossil fuels.
And here's something interesting. The big tech companies like Microsoft, Google, and Amazon are starting to invest in nuclear, especially SMRs, to power their data center and AI operations. So that could be a sign of things to come.
Yeah, you need a good understanding of this industry. It's unique with its risks and rewards. Growth is possible, but you have to factor in the high initial costs, the regulations, the public perception, and the competition.
Well, this has been a truly deep dive into the world of nuclear energy. We've gone from the atom to geopolitics to the economics of it all. Just to recap the key takeaways, nuclear power has a lot of potential. It's low carbon, energy dense, and reliable.
But also comes with big challenges waste disposal, safety concerns, high costs, and a public image problem. That said, there are signs of a possible revival driven by climate change, energy needs, and advances in SMR technology.
A very comprehensive and insightful overview. And that brings us to our final thought for you, our listener. We've explored the technology, the policy, the public opinion, and the economics. So, what do you think is the most crucial factor that will shape the future of nuclear power? Let us know. We'd love to hear from you.
Great, so we encourage you to keep thinking about this important and fascinating topic. Thanks for joining. The content provided is for informational and educational purposes only. The opinions expressed by the hosts and guests are their own and do not reflect the views of any affiliated organizations or institutions. Investing involves risks, including the potential loss of principal. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Listeners are encouraged to conduct their own research, consult with qualified financial advisors before making any financial decisions. The information shared is based on current market trends and data available at the time of recording and may change over time.